Our speaker for today, Michael is chair of the Space Industry Association of Australia. The peak national body for the Australian space industry was formed in 1992. He practiced law in Adelaide for 41 years, retiring in 2014. He's a lawyer turned space engineer. Actually, I've thought that Michael is a model for any of you fellas out there, not me, I'm already retired, who are planning a retirement and you turn from a lawyer into running the space business in Australia. It's absolutely marvellous. In 1996, he obtained a Master of Space Studies degree from the International Space University in Strasbourg, France, where he is now a volunteer faculty member and a member of its Board of Trustees. Local space-related projects that Michael has been involved in include proposing the Adelaide bid and chairing the local organising committee of the International Astronautical Congress that was held in Adelaide late last year, which I, along with about 4,300 other people, attended. And I can tell you that as an engineer myself, it was a week of bliss for me. I wished I was 40 or 50 years younger. He also chairs the management committee of the International Space University of South Australia's Southern Hemisphere Space Studies program held annually in Adelaide. Rotarians and guests, I present Michael Davis.
Thank you very much, John, for your kind introduction and for your invitation to speak to the Adelaide Rotary Club. As John has mentioned, my main job these days is to chair the Space Industry Association of Australia, and we have really seen a wonderful renaissance in the space industry in this country, and I hope I'll be able to tell you a few interesting facts about what's happened recently in our industry. But I'd like to start at the beginning of our history of space in this country, which of course was the establishment of the Woomera Range 71 years ago in 1947. It was established, and it was established by the Australian government at the request of the UK government immediately after the Second World War, because the UK was interested in developing its own missile technology in response to the German missile technology that caused great harm in Britain during the Second World War. And so Australia was the obvious place to come for wide open spaces with very little population and anything that you could possibly hit if something goes wrong with your missile. And so the Australian government set aside two very large areas of unpopulated land, one in South Australia to the northwest of a brand new village called Woomera, and also another very large area in northwestern Western Australia. And the idea was to test ballistic missiles. And so that was the start of our space industry in this country. So one of the features of our history of space activity in this country is our geographic advantages. And many other countries have seen the opportunity of cooperating and collaborating with Australia in relation to ground facilities, that is, facilities to track and monitor and communicate with space missions. And so a strong feature of our space history is that we have provided the real estate for our international partners. And because we're in the Southern Hemisphere, we have a view of the universe which is different, of course, from the Northern Hemisphere. And it's very important for any space exploration mission to be able to be tracked from the southern hemisphere as well as the northern hemisphere. And so we've established facilities for the Americans, for the Europeans, and we are obviously one of the leaders in space ground facilities and tracking and telemetry in the world. But I'd like to just quickly mention a few of our proud moments in our space history. The first was 51 years ago when we launched Australia's first Australian-built satellite called FEDSAT, and it was built right here in Adelaide in a record time of 11 months by the University of Adelaide and the Weapons Research Establishment at Salisbury. And it was a big success, and at the time it established our reputation as a spacefaring country. We were only the third country in the world to launch our own satellite from our own territory. And so we started very well, and we started with a generation of engineers and scientists who were world leading in their expertise, not only in tracking and telemetry and telecommunications, but also in designing and building satellites. 2 years later, we had a very important role in the Apollo program, the US Apollo program, and the landing of the first humans on the moon. And next year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of that event. I don't know about you, but I remember exactly where I was on the day that Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. I was in a lecture room at the Institute of Technology, and it was about lunchtime in Adelaide. And I remember sitting there with hundreds of other students watching it on black and white TV. And it's one of those really big moments in history, in human history. And next year you'll hear a lot more about it because it's the 50th anniversary. And Australia's role was really important. That's a shot from the television coverage of the moon landing. It's a little bit clearer than those of you who can remember watching it probably saw on TV. And the story of how that television picture was broadcast around the world is quite interesting. It involved various large receiving antennas around the world. There was one in Goldstone in California, and there were 3 in Australia, Parkes, Tidbinbilla and Honeysuckle Creek. The Parkes dish was 64 metres in diameter. It was a huge dish, and it was bigger than the other 2 dishes in Australia. All 3 dishes were based around in the Canberra region, and the idea was that the Parkes dish would be the largest dish, would be used to pick up the TV signals if the Goldstone dish in California wasn't receiving strong enough signals. But the landing was brought forward, the stepping onto the moon was brought forward, and believe it or not, NASA planned the mission so that when the lunar lander landed on the moon, the 2 astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, were supposed to have a sleep. And of course, they decided that there was no way that they could go to sleep, having just landed on the moon. And so they decided, well, it was decided to bring the stepping onto the moon forward. The problem was that the moon was not within range of our receiving dishes. It was still coming up over the horizon because it was a few hours earlier than planned. But the smaller dish at Honeysuckle Creek was able to pick up a signal which wasn't a very strong signal, but it was better than the one they were getting in California. And so they used the weak signal from Honeysuckle Creek for the first 9 minutes until the moon came into view of the larger Parkes telescope, which is the 64-metre antenna, and then the quality of the pictures improved quite dramatically after 9 minutes. I don't remember this, but this is well documented. So that was Australia's role in the Apollo. Well, that was the highlight of Australia's role in the Apollo program, although we tracked and received pictures from all of the US moon exploration missions. And next year, I believe it's likely that we will hear a lot more from NASA and the US about their plans to return to the moon. And the plans we've seen so far involve technology which is very similar to the technology they used 50 years ago to land on the moon and then to rejoin the orbiting spacecraft from the moon. So in terms of lunar technology, we're still basically using engineering and technology developed more than 50 years ago. Another highlight of Australian space was the second Australian-built satellite, or the second government-funded Australian-built satellite, which is called FEDSAT in 2002. And again, most of the work was in the design and tracking of that satellite was done here in South Australia at the Institute of Telecommunications Research at UniSA at Mawson Lakes. And so we had a big role in Australia's second publicly funded satellite. It was launched as a gift to the Australian government by the Japanese in December 2002. And again, it was a success. It was a scientific experimental satellite that produced lots of good data and also demonstrated that one generation later that we have the expertise and knowledge to design and build our own satellites. Some of you may recall that in 2010, Woomera was the site for the return of the Japanese scientific mission to the asteroid called Hayabusa. And I wasn't lucky enough to be there to see the return, but there was a spectacular return to the Woomera range of that Japanese scientific mission. And there's another one planned in the next few years. In terms of human spaceflight, we've got 2 Aussie astronauts, and one of them I know has been a previous speaker at this lunch, Andy Thomas, and the other is Dr. Paul Scully-Power, who's based in Sydney. The interesting thing, of course, about these 2 astronauts is that they're wearing the flag of another country, and they both had to become US citizens in order to be selected for the US space program, but they both retained their Australian citizenship and both are very strong advocates for the Australian space industry. Other interesting events in our 70-year history include plans to launch our own commercial satellites from Australia. And I was very involved in some of these plans about 15 years ago as a lawyer, but unfortunately they didn't get off the ground literally, but they did establish that we do have the potential to be a commercial launch provider. In other words, we do have the potential in this country to launch our own satellites, and there are current plans, there are companies with current plans to launch commercial satellites from Australia 15 years later. But some of these companies were the first space startups. There's a lot of talk about the new entrepreneurial interest in space in this country, but it did start over 15 years ago. We have various areas of niche capability in space research and development, and I've just put up 3 examples there. We do good work in developing thrusters for satellites at the Australian National University, as well as many other areas of research. The University of South Australia in Adelaide has been a world leader in satellite communications research. And the University of Queensland has specialised in hypersonics, which is a future method of space travel and space propulsion. And I notice that we have the manager of Singapore Airlines here with us today, Erin Gurrow, and companies like Singapore Airlines will one day be looking at hypersonics as a method of intercontinental travel to dramatically reduce the time taken to get from one side of the globe to the other. We're also a world leader in astronomy, both radio astronomy and optical astronomy. And some of you would have heard of the Square Kilometre Array project, which will give us a huge increase in the amount of information we get from the outer universe, which is a very big international project involving an array of thousands of small dishes mainly in Western Australia in partnership with South Africa, but actually spreading all the way over to New Zealand. And our astronomers are world leading and strongly supported by the Australian government. We also have expertise in space debris monitoring and mitigation, and this is an increasingly pressing problem for satellite operators. The amount of debris in various altitudes of Earth orbit, and there is a big international effort to, first of all, to track the debris, because even a small amount of debris of the size of a centimetre can cause damage to orbiting spacecraft. And last week you might have read that there was a small hole punctured in the International Space Station, which initially was plugged when the astronaut had to put his finger in the hole, and then eventually they managed to plug it, but that was caused by a very small piece of debris. And so tracking smaller and smaller pieces of debris is very important, because if you know where the debris is, you can steer your spacecraft out of the way. And there are quite a lot of work's being done in Australia on that. And in South Australia, given that we're all South Australians, I should mention that we have a state government agency called the South Australian Space Industry Centre, established a couple of years ago, and it's doing really good work developing the space ecosystem in this state. That is, in coordinating and keeping people working with each other and cooperating, especially the newer entrepreneurial ventures in space in this state. And I know that Flavia Tata-Nardini has already spoken to this lunch. She's the founder and managing director of Fleet Space Technologies, and her vision is to design, build and launch a constellation of 100 CubeSats to provide internet connectivity direct from the satellite to the ground. It's a very exciting and adventurous and ambitious project, and it's all being done right here in Adelaide. Other entrepreneurial companies include Myriota, Innovore, Small World Communications and NewmanSat and Newman Space. And we also do the Southern Hemisphere Space Studies program in Adelaide, and again Erin Gurrow is one of our graduates, and he's made a slight detour into commercial aviation, but I'm sure one day he'll come back into the space industry. So it's great to see you here today. But I've been asked to say a few words about our International Astronautical Congress, which we held right here last September. I think it was the biggest ever Congress ever held in Adelaide. We got 4,500 delegates from all around the world, and it was a big success. And one of the reasons that we decided to bid for and host the Congress was that we wanted to put as much pressure as we could on the Australian government to think about establishing a national space agency. And I'm very pleased to say that we were successful. And Senator Simon Birmingham was the speaker, the Commonwealth Government speaker at the opening ceremony, and that was when the Commonwealth Government actually committed to having a national space agency. And when he made the announcement, there was this huge roar from the 4,000 people in the plenary hall at the Adelaide Convention Centre. And I don't think as a politician he'd ever heard such a roar of approval for a speech that he had given, especially when you take into account the fact that he was Minister for Education, which is quite a tough portfolio. So that was a fantastic achievement. Well, that was what we felt as if the effort of organising this huge Congress was justified by the government announcement. And we're seeing many, many benefits flowing out of the fact that we had the world's biggest space congress in Adelaide last year, and these are ongoing. So in response to the pressure or the advocacy that we performed in favour of a space agency, the government commissioned a review by an expert reference group, and I was fortunate enough to be a member of that group, and that's our report, which was published in March this year, and that's the blueprint for our national space program. And it concluded that a national space agency is needed for international engagement as well as national engagement, to set national policy and strategy, but most importantly to facilitate industry growth. And it set a target of tripling the size of our industry in the next 12 years. And so there's a very ambitious economic growth target of increasing the size of our industry and adding to jobs and adding to prosperity through space technology development in this country. And the agency opened on the 1st of July this year, so we're very early in the development of the new national space program, and of course the government is taking it cautiously, and we will need to ensure that the political support for the agency continues, because without political support, small agencies can easily wither and die. So part of our mission as the Space Industry Association is to keep up the pressure, to keep up the public support for what we're doing in order to ensure that the politicians maintain their support, including budgetary support. So finally, I'd just like to tell you about the book, The History of Australian Space, that we published last year at the Congress. This is a beautifully written and illustrated history of the 70 years of Australian space that I briefly outlined today. It was written by Kerry Doherty, who is Australia's leading space historian, and it's available for sale via our website. So if you're interested in reading more about the history that I've spoken about today, just go to our website and you can order online. And I'd like to take this opportunity to present this copy to the Rotary Club of Adelaide.
Thank you, Michael. Now, there must be some questions from an audience as intelligent and forward-looking as this. Who's the first? One, yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you. That was wonderful. I mean, I work in information technology, but anything in the realms of being geeky just fascinates me. I love it. Now, I'm going to ask the elephant in the room question, which I'm sure you're expecting. Will Adelaide be the home of the Australian Space Agency? And if you can't answer that one, when will we know?
Yes, I was expecting that question. We'll know. Well, we don't know when we'll know, but we've just had our third Commonwealth Minister for Space in 12 months appointed, Karen Andrews, and she's a Queenslander. But she's also an engineer, which is, there are too many lawyers in Parliament, not enough engineers, so I'm delighted that she has that background. The momentum behind the so-called competition between the states to host the space agency was very much supported by the previous minister, Michaelia Cash. So we really don't know what the appointment of the new minister will produce. I think the idea behind the competition between the states was to try to elicit contributions from the states to the national space program. And we're hoping as a national, I'm being very careful in my answer because I'm chair of the national industry, and we have state government members, we have agency members, we have members with very diverse interests on this topic. So we're hoping that the bids that the various state governments make will translate into contributions to research, to infrastructure, to facilities on a national basis. And the South Australian government has led the way, there's no question about that. When they agreed to support our bid for the Congress, they saw it as an opportunity to build industry in South Australia. So wherever the Space Agency headquarters ends up being, I'm confident that at least the South Australian government will be strongly behind it, and I suspect that it will be similar in other states.
Thanks, Mike. Now there's another question over here, son. Yes. Another one? Michael, thank you very much for talking to us today. It's unusual that we are able to get a speaker that addresses a subject at a national level, and also the beginning of what hopefully will be a huge movement in Australia, which Australia has needed for many, many years, like the nuclear industry. I'm talking as an engineer now. And I would like to, well, first of all, thank you for the book that you presented to President Rob. But I would like you to take a memento of this meeting, which is actually, it's a pen designed to simulate an Apollo rocket, like that. So when you look at it, you'll remember that. Ladies and gentlemen, please.